Hi guys, and welcome back to Beyond the Apex. Today we're going to be talking about the Australian Grand Prix. Now we're a little bit behind, but obviously we're on Easter break and we haven't had F1 for a couple of weekends, but we're back with a race recap. Now obviously slightly different to the first couple of videos. I'm by myself, I'm at home. Me and Sam went home for Easter because we're at uni together, but I do go back this weekend, so don't worry, we'll be back together soon. But instead of listening to 24 minutes of me talking this time, Sam is gonna pretty much go through the race as a recap, and I'm gonna stick to the FIA issues and stuff that we had to do with the regulations. So I'm gonna butt in his footage pretty much the entire video. So yeah, I hope you enjoy, and let's get into it.
Hi guys, welcome back to my section of the Beyond the Apex podcast this week. Obviously I missed out the Saudi Grand Prix. I was the most ill I've probably ever been. But in this week's episode, obviously I'm in a very different place to Abby at the moment. I'm back at uni. I came back a week earlier to do some revision, and obviously she's back home. So we're going to be kind of trying to weave it in between both of our clips. So I'm mainly going to be talking about what happened in the race, and kind of the main talking points for each team, like I usually do. And then Abby's going to be taking over the whole FIA side, which she's an absolute expert in. So I've just left that to her. So firstly, it was probably the most dramatic race we've had in a long time. 4 red flags, 3 restarts, and it was definitely worth waking up at 6 o'clock in the morning to watch.
Right, so let's get into the race. What happened? Broad statement. A lot happened. So we had safety car on lap 1 where Charles Leclerc, I'm reading this off my iPad by the way, I can't remember it. My brain is fuzzy from law exams. Safety car lap 1, Charles Leclerc and Lance Stroll. That was a racing incident. They, yeah, pretty much. But the safety car was issued, was it? Yes, it was. It was. I'm questioning myself now. I can remember it was issued quite quickly. One of the things with the FIA that I find is like the decisions are very not as snappy. Like I know it's really hard to be snappy, but in the area that I work in or like have observed in, you know, on a club level, it's instant decisions. You know, someone's crashed, like it's dangerous, like red flag. And vice versa, whereas the FIA, I feel like they just take a little bit of time sometimes. Obviously that's not a dig, it's just something I've observed that is slightly different, but I think that was quite good from them, to be honest. And then we also had safety car lap 7 where Alex Albon lost the rear of the car at turn 7. He was running in P6, so that's such a shame. I'm probably repeating everything Sam is saying on this because that's nothing to do with regulations, but the regulations, that brought out a red flag, right? Because there are marshals on track and there was machinery near the racing line, right? So a valid red flag because of what we've seen before. It makes sense to do so, and I was actually really impressed because they didn't actually, obviously the machinery was literally so close to the racing line, it was insane. And they brought out the red flag instantly, just as like the TV had shown the machinery. So I was like, oh, that's really quite good, because sometimes in the past we've seen on TV you'll be watching and there's literally a machine right on the racing line, nothing, the race is still going on. But they acted really well, and that's actually it actually shows that from the issues we've had previously, they have sorted them out. You know, like I've said before, they've had meetings and stuff with really important people to basically, what's the word? Improve some of the regulations in terms of the sport. And obviously that is an example of where they have improved. Well, I mean, fingers crossed, it's only one time, but they have improved what they do in that situation, if that makes sense, so that it's safe for the drivers as well, and the marshals, obviously.
But obviously it was another Red Bull and Max masterclass. That car really is an absolute beast in the straights. and you could see it with Hamilton. He literally, I don't think it was even kind of a challenge for Max. And I kind of wanted to talk about this with Max because obviously a lot of people say it's the car, and a lot of people say he's a very kind of aggressive racer, and he is to a certain degree. However, on that first lap in Australia, you really could kind of see how much his maturity has grown, mainly because of the fact that he just pulled out of the moves. With George, he knew that he was alongside. He had no reason to kind of attack that corner, let George pass. He knew that his car would be able to get past George, and therefore just let it go. Be without damage, and then just get through. And then with Hamilton, again, firstly, it was a fantastic move by Hamilton, and I'm going to go on to talk about Hamilton later on. But again, he didn't kind of try and push Hamilton onto the apex like maybe in 2017, 2018 he would have done. So it was very kind of impressive, not impressive to kind of see Max let drivers pass, but to see his maturity and how much he's kind of grown from where he was a couple of years ago. So I do think that was quite impressive. Going on to Checo, he kind of has shown that on the Australian weekend why he won't be in a championship battle, and I do think Max is just going to run away with this championship. Mainly because Max doesn't have weekends where he makes mistakes. He is quick out of the blocks, takes him a lap to get on pace, and he's there. Whereas we've seen with Checo this weekend that actually he has these weekends where he's just off the pace and he's constantly making mistakes. That practice 3 was unbelievable. It was full of mistakes from Checo. He just couldn't get a lap in. And then we saw, obviously, I think Red Bull did say that it was a car problem, or they had been struggling with a car problem all weekend. But at the same time, that mistake from Checo in Q1 basically just ruined his weekend. And I'm one of the people who kind of goes, I don't know how he got driver of the day, because really getting 5th in that car when only 12 people finished, that's actually quite a disappointing result, I think, from Checo. And I think if he carries on kind of having weekends like this that we've seen in 2022, 2021, he's just has these weekends where he's not on the pace. And I really think that this has shown why he won't be a championship contender to Max, and it is just going to be Max walking away with this. Right, so I am going to need the help of my iPad for this one because I don't want to get things wrong. But let's talk about the 107% rule. Now, I've spoken about this in previous videos, and if you're a motorsport fan or if you've watched the other ones, then you will probably know the 107% rule is across several motorsport categories, right? Not just Formula 1, it's a well-known motorsport thing. And basically, you have to qualify within the 107% of the top driver to be able to race. And basically, the reason for that is because of safety. You know, you can't have someone that's too slow on the track. They all have to be within the same sort of speed limit, if that makes sense. Otherwise, if you've got someone really, really slow, that could be very dangerous because they're not on the pace of the other drivers. And then obviously you've got like overtaking, lapping and all that jazz. And it's just, they're deemed to be not as competent, basically. So that's the 107% rule. So if you don't meet that, then sometimes the stewards can decide whether or not you race or not. Obviously in Formula 1, if the circumstances change, because you're not just going to let a driver not race because they are in Formula 1 for a reason, if that makes sense. But we saw this issue come up actually this weekend at the Australian Grand Prix. So Perez changed not himself, Perez did not go to the car himself and change the power units, but the team at Red Bull had changed the power unit elements in the car. So the third energy store and the third control electronics, and changes to the suspension. So basically they hadn't like written this out to the technical delegate of the FIA. So and it was during Parc Ferme actually. Yeah. So it wasn't approved. So that meant he had to start from pit lane, and it meant that he couldn't do quali, right? So that meant that obviously he didn't qualify in the 107% because he didn't qualify at all, right? So therefore so you've got one issue of like they changed stuff during Parc Ferme when they shouldn't have, or like they should have like notified the technical delegate that they were doing it or whatever.
that meant he couldn't qualify. So then he started in the pit lane for the race, which meant that he didn't have a qualifying time in Q1, right? So that meant that he wasn't in the 107% for that race, if that makes sense, right? He didn't qualify in the 107% full stop. So this brings about an issue. The stewards have to look at it and go like, well, I mean, obviously they're not going to be like Perez can't race, because Perez has been racing for years, but he was allowed to race, but obviously it brings up that issue. He's not within the 107%. Obviously, like I said before, the whole safety thing and him not being on the pace is really irrelevant. He didn't meet the 107% criteria because of technical issues, right, with the car, not because he wasn't able to meet that pace. So that was a fair enough decision to let him race, but an interesting point nonetheless.
So then, going on to Ferrari, I think this season, unfortunately, they are the 4th quickest car, and it is a shame because last year they were so on the pace and they could somewhat compete in every race. But yeah, I mean, in quali they were very off the pace. I think it was 6th and 8th, or 6th and 7th, I can't quite remember. Their race pace was a little bit better than their quali pace. I mean, they were kind of able to fight with those cars, but it just wasn't on the level of the Mercs and the Astons. I mean, Sainz never would have caught Fernando, for instance. And Sainz did get screwed over with the safety car in the pit stop and then the eventual red flag for the gravel, which I'm sure Abby will talk about at some point. But yeah, he did get very much screwed over by that and did make a very, very good drive back to what would have been on the podium. But unfortunately, due to the penalty, he did get pushed back out of the points. I'm on the side that the penalty was deserved. He did fly straight into the side of Alonso and then cause multiple incidents after that. Abby might disagree with me because she's going to talk about that a lot, but obviously the right of review was waived a couple of days ago because obviously we're recording this about 2 weeks later. But yeah, I do agree with the FIA there that it was a 5-second penalty. Could they have done more to kind of help Sainz in like trying to get some point? I don't know, but yeah, Abby's going to cover that in a lot more detail than me. Going on to Mercedes, the first 10 laps, it was Mercedes of old. Honestly, it was very cool to see them kind of get into first and second and then be able to somewhat hold it. I disagree with people saying that George was moaning on the radio for Hamilton pushing him. I'm not sure why the team allowed Hamilton to push him at the start. Not on the start, but it was about the 4th lap when Hamilton kind of nearly went side by side with him. It was quite strange when they were telling George to manage the pace. But I genuinely do believe that if it wasn't for the safety car and the red flag, Mercedes would have been in with a much bigger chance than they did have in the end for getting the win. Because I think with 2 of them up there, they would have been able to kind of try and at least control Max a lot more. But this pace is very clearly track dependent. Lewis came out and said they hadn't made any upgrades to the car. They're just basically understanding it a little bit better. But yeah, it is just track dependent. Although the first runs in Q3 it did make certainly me very excited because I think the top 5 were within a tenth of each other, and I was like, oh my god, everyone's got pace. It's going to be a great season. But unfortunately, the Red Bulls are just that little bit more ahead, and I do think it is Merc versus Aston for that second quickest car, and they will be trading podiums throughout the year, I think. I also just want to talk about qualifying again for a second. The pace that George has in quali at the moment is quite spectacular, bearing in mind he has out-qualified Lewis in all 3 races this season so far. And I do think, especially last season as well, he did somewhat have an edge on Lewis, or was very close to him. I think the average gap at the end of the season was 0.05 seconds to Lewis. But George is very clearly quicker than Lewis in qualifying this year, and I do think that's going to be very interesting to see what happens when the car gets quicker, because obviously if George can keep up this quali pace, he's always going to be ahead of Lewis, and Lewis is always going to have to make that overtake on track. So it's going to be very interesting.
Right, so let's go to the controversy between Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton. Now, we are no stranger as Formula One fans to the drama between these two. There is always going to be a bit of tension between those two, is there not? So we had an issue. So it was a safety car restart, right? And they were basically lining up on the grid to start again. And Lewis was in front and he was following the safety car. And normally under the regulations you have to have 10, I'm getting confused, sorry, because I'm so used to club meeting regulations. Is it 10? 10 car lengths. It's not on a club level, it's 3, but it's 10 car lengths within the safety car, right? You have to be within 10 car lengths of the safety car. And unless it's returning to the pits, right? That's what it says in the regulations, unless returning to the pits. The safety car was supposed to return to the pits, and it did, right? So Lewis obviously dropped back, going up to the grid. So this sparked controversy with Max, because Max, you know, initially was like, well, on the radio, I think he said, you know, he's slowing them down, like he slowed everyone down, everyone was literally like tripping over one another, and Max was like, that's not allowed, that's not allowed. But obviously in the regulations it says you must keep within 10 car lengths of the safety car, which is the car in front, unless it's going into the pits, right? And obviously it was going into the pits, so 2 and 2 is equaling 4. So I'll read out the regulations to you, because it's actually really interesting. During the race I was searching up the regulations. So this is the F1 sporting regulations, article 58.11. So if track conditions are considered suitable to resume the sprint session or the race from standing start, the message standing start procedure will be sent to all competitors using the official messaging system at the time no later than 1 minute signal detailed in article when the clerk of the course decides it is safe to call in the safety car, the message standing start will be sent to all competitors using the official messaging system. All FIA light panels will display SS and the safety car's orange lights will be extinguished. This is when Lewis decided to drop back, because obviously he realised the safety car is coming in this lap, right? To continue, this will be a signal to the competitors and drivers that the safety car will be entering the pit lane at the end of the lap, right? At this point, the first car in line behind the safety car may dictate the pace, and if necessary, fall more than 10 car lengths behind it. So that basically says it all, doesn't it? That's basically it, right? So Lewis was able to dictate the pace of the pack going in to the restart, right? And obviously Max was like, oh, that's not allowed, but really in the regulations it says it is. So that was a major issue for the weekend, because we heard it on the radio, I think, as I was gonna say as fans, but watching it on the TV, you know, Max was like, oh, it's not allowed, but I don't know what he said exactly, but it is allowed, and Lewis was right. And then we have George Russell's incident. So, what a shame, because he was running so well, so well. But he had a power unit issue, which meant that his car literally caught on fire, and he had to stop just on the exit of the pit lane. Why can't I speak? Not on the exit of the pits, basically. He pulled in there, so it wasn't on the racing line, but it was on the exit of the pits, right? So the FIA issued a virtual safety car, which I think is valid, and they also closed the pit lane, which I was really scared they weren't gonna do to begin with. And I was like, if they don't close that, because if you issue a virtual safety car, obviously the cars have to slow down 40% off pace, right? So basically you get a kind of a free pit stop, essentially. So obviously a lot of teams are going to go and make use of that and go into the pits when there is a safety car or a virtual safety car. But having George Russell's car that was on fire on the exit of the pits, I was a bit like, if that's... No one's going to be able to get out of the pits, so that makes no sense. So really good decision to close the pits. I don't know, they probably couldn't have made the decision faster. Maybe I'm just being a bit picky. But yeah, I was a bit worried they wouldn't. But yeah, that was from the FIA really good decisions. Well, you know, the way it quickly initiated the virtual safety car, because it was in a dangerous position. You had marshals on track, and obviously closing the pit lane was necessary because they had to push the car back into the sort of pits to then get it off track, basically. So yeah.
And then finally, in this little section, Alpine. Now, it went from being one hell of a race for Alpine to being an absolute catastrophe. The accident was very unfortunate, and funny enough, I have spoken about it in depth with my dad, who is a raging Gasly fan, who believes that Gasly would never do anything wrong, and is adamant that it wasn't Gasly's fault. But I do believe it was Gasly's fault, a majority anyway. I don't know why Gasly wouldn't look in his mirrors, and he did cause a lot of points drop for the team. So that was unfortunate because he did deserve a lot of points that race. He drove very, very well, was keeping with signs, and he deserved a P5, P6 in the race. So it was a shame to see Alpine lose points, but at the same time, as you can see, I'm a diehard McLaren fan. I'll go on to that in the next bit. But we are going to be fighting them for P5 in the Constructors this year. So it is nice to see that they're losing points because they do have a much quicker car than we do. So yeah.
So in terms of the incident between Gasly and Ocon, you know, the one where we ended up seeing them both in the wall, which caused the red flag. Well, one of the reasons why it caused the red flag. This was something that the stewards deemed to have no further action required. It was a racing incident. Now, I'm not too sure how much I agree with that statement, but anyway, they said both cars recognised and accepted the fact that it was a racing incident. In the circumstances, we took no further action. Competitors, they have a right to appeal, but basically, they reviewed all the data and they said it wasn't wholly one person's fault. So they were both pretty much to blame, which means it was more or less a racing incident, which, yeah, in that situation it seems fair, but obviously that issue itself caused the whole controversy to come.
So now going on to obviously my favourite team, McLaren. We haven't had the best season at all at the moment, but Australia was one hell of a weekend for us. The car definitely had a much stronger pace than at Saudi and Bahrain. Even though I have been saying that the car has pace, we have just got unlucky the first two races, but the pace was shown, and we deserved points definitely with at least one car, which we would have got with Lando overtaking Hulkenberg at the end, I think for P8 in the end. So a lot of points, bearing in mind that's kind of where we're going to be scrapping this season, at the lower end of the points. But it does look like we're battling for the sixth fastest car with another two teams who I'll mention later on. But also, great job for Oscar as well. It was nice to see at the end when he pitted in the safety car. I think he would have got into the points. Obviously he was on soft and everyone else in front of him were on very old hards. So I think if that safety car had kind of been allowed, he would have been able to kind of get in the points. But he had a cool head in the red flag restart, and he got in the points, and that's a massive point total for the team. So obviously I tried to stay neutral, but I was very happy at the end of this. Obviously with P5 in the Constructors at the moment, that's not going to stay. However, I am very happy at the moment. The car obviously still has a lot of upgrades it needs to make. Baku for us is in 2 weeks, so we should have a nice upgrade package for that, and hopefully a little bit more pace will be shown, and we'll be able to battle Alpine a lot more than we are already. Going on to Alfa Romeo, now going from a very, very strong race to, in my opinion, was a horrific race for Alfa Romeo. It really, really was, and especially Bottas. Bottas's race it was a horrific race for him, in my opinion. He was, I believe, last. He was just in front of Sainz, so we got P11 in the end. P11 for someone with that much experience, being outperformed by his teammates so much. it really wasn't a good race, and they only managed to scrap 2 points in the end, which for Alfa Romeo they should be aiming a lot higher than that. They should have been aiming higher than Haas in the end, in my opinion. And even during the race, they were running at the lower end of the grid, not really battling with anyone. I think Joe was about 31 seconds off of Piastri, which is just not where that team should be. And that was before the safety car, so obviously Oscar could pit for softs and it wouldn't make a difference. So if Joe had actually been in his safety car window, obviously I think they would have had a much more different race. So it's just showing that team needs to get on top of that car, because at the moment they can't do anything. But going again from a devastating race to one hell of a race, Aston Martin. Obviously I am a big Fernando Alonso fan, and I'm loving what Aston Martin are doing at the moment, along with I think every other Formula 1 fan. And great pace once again, showing that car really isn't track dependent. It can fight on every circuit that it comes to, and show great quality and race pace. Obviously Fernando was just behind the Mercs, so he was able to fight, and yeah, it is a dream to watch Fernando drive. But I will say that Fernando's driving in the Australian Grand Prix showed how much of a good driver Lewis is. And obviously I'm not a Lewis fan at all, I will say that outrightly. In 2021 I supported Max for the championship, and I've never really been a Hamilton fan, but I've always respected how much of a good driver he is. And seeing Fernando kind of trying to play games with him throughout the entire race and pushing at certain points and not at the other points, and kind of trying his hardest to get an edge on Lewis, and Lewis just had none of it, and he was calm throughout the entire race, and he made some great moves, and yeah, I was just going to put that out there. Also, I just want to go back from Alfa Romeo, because obviously that is my segment of the podcast where I get to speak about Pourchaire, obviously the Alfa Romeo reserve driver, currently racing in F2. And just to briefly talk about him, it was an okay weekend for Pourchaire. He got on the podium in the feature race, had not the greatest sprint race, but he is currently second in the standings, and even though he is second behind Iwasa, his season is kind of coming back on track. Saudi is just such a joker track for him, and it's nice to see him kind of get back up there again. Although in qualifying, it was quite kind of, my heart was in my mouth, because he was down in 11th, 10th throughout the entire quali, and then jumped up to P2, and then there was a red flag and they stopped quali. So it was kind of the best result possible for Teo this weekend, so happy about that. And obviously with Aston Martin, going back onto Aston Martin, it is clear that Alonso is the first driver. And also, talking about Alonso, I do really think he's top 3 drivers on the grid, and one of the main reasons for that is his experience. And directly after the final red flag was called, he immediately remembered Silverstone and was immediately onto his radio engineer going, the grid should be reset to what it was at the restart, I should be here, blah blah blah. And having that level of knowledge of the regs while racing a Formula 1 car is something that only the best, the greatest have. And seeing that, it just put a smile on my face, because Alonso really is on another level, and clearly the first driver in that team. Also, go on to Stroll. He was having a good race. He probably would have been 5th, 6th without the red flags. I think he would have probably got Gasly without the safety car at the end. So great points for the team, and obviously he got 4th in the end. So a massive pool of points for the team. They're second at the moment, I believe, in the standings. And yeah, that car is just so good. I'm so happy for Aston Martin.
Okay, so secondly, let's talk about the pit lane speed limit. The pit lane speed limit in F1 is 80 kilometers per hour, right? And the cars have a setting that you can set to that when they're coming into the pits, right? Now, during the weekend, Lance Stroll was found to be exceeding the pit lane speed limit by 0.1 kilometres an hour. Yes, you heard me right, 0.1 kilometres per hour over the limit. 2 and 2 is not adding up, but okay. So that was the issue. And that was, I'm going to quote this from here, but that was in breach of Article 34.7 of the Formula 1 sporting regulations, so not the sporting regulations, not the International Sporting Code. But, so that means that relates to F1. So Aston Martin would find €100. Was it €100? Yeah, €100 for that. As a massive team that have just built their new headquarters at Silverstone and spent millions on it, and millions on getting their car to where it is today, you know, because we've seen the rise of Aston Martin this season. €100. It makes me wonder that if the fine is €100, what's to stop them doing it? If that's the case, because surely that is such an insignificant amount that you do. Then I suppose speeding the pit lane, like, what's the point, I guess? And also, this wasn't during the race, was it? I'm not sure. But yeah, anyways, €100 to Aston Martin for speeding by 0.1 kilometres per hour.
Going on to another team who had a decent weekend, Haas. So Haas showed very, very strong pace again. I think they are battling McLaren for the 6th fastest car. And it was kind of interesting to see that the Haas and the McLaren are very kind of equal on pace, and it was really Lando's talent that got him past towards the end of the race. But this race also showed how much of a good driver Hülkenberg is. He clearly has an edge on Magnussen in both quali and in the race. And his cool, calm head just allowed him to run in the points, know that Lando wasn't his battle, drop down to 9th, get some good points, and we were also completely robbed of a Hülkenberg podium because obviously if the grid hadn't been returned to where it was, Hülkenberg would have been 4th and would have moved up to 3rd because of Sainz's penalty. So we really were robbed of a Hülkenberg podium, and it's showing that the Hülkenberg podium curse really is real. That man will never be able to get on the podium. Not because of his talent, just because no one, the F1 gods just don't want him to stand up on that 3rd step or the 2nd step. So yeah, unfortunate, but again, a really good weekend for Haas, and they got 7th in the end, so a really good haul of points as well.
Another really interesting point that happened, that I actually got a notification come up on my phone on the FIA's, on the F1's app. That's not English. On the F1 app, it came up saying, breaking news, Haas have appealed something or other. So Haas have appealed, basically, right, I'm going to explain this because it took me a while to understand. They appealed the provisional classification, right, because obviously it was red flagged because Kevin crashed at turn 2 into the barriers, and his right rear wheel came off, right? So that meant that there was a standing start that restarted, right? And that standing restart is where Carlos Sainz tapped Alonso, they span, both Alpines crashed out, Williams also collected, the Williams of Logan Sargent also collected Nick de Vries and Bosch. It was like World War III happened on the racetrack, right? So, obviously, because of that, it all literally happened in the first turn. So the FIA instantly red flagged and we were going to do another restart again, right? So they basically, for that, went back to the original classifications of that restart before. But a count back is basically what most motorsport fans would know it as. They did a count back because it's basically taking it from Silverstone, where they didn't complete a whole sector of the track. So that meant that basically if you don't complete a whole sector of the track and there's a red flag on the restart or on the start, then you go back to the original classifications, you do the count back. this is what Haas were protesting. They protested the fact that, was it one of their drivers, I can't remember which one it was now, I can't remember, but basically the countback hindered them because they actually gained positions before the red flag came out, and obviously then they had to count back, and then they were back to where they were before. So that's what they were protesting. But really, if you look at the regulations and you look at the precedent that was set at Silverstone, they didn't complete a sector. So the FIA and the stewards and the race control team, they made the right decision by doing the count back, because that is what we've done before. Like, consistency is key. Do you know what I mean?
So, going on to the final two teams that I'm going to talk about in my side of the podcast, AlphaTauri and Williams. So, AlphaTauri, even though they got a point with Tsunoda, it really is showing that that car is the slowest car on the grid at the moment. It really is, and Yuki is outperforming that car, I think. And I'm going to say now, I do think the hate on De Vries is way too strong at the moment. I do think he is performing where that car should be, and Yuki is just outperforming the car. And obviously, the crash at the end from De Vries was a very, very strange mistake, even though there is kind of the excuse that all of the drivers were struggling with tyre temperature, and because he is a rookie, that is somewhat excusable. But yeah, I don't think De Vries is doing that bad of a job. He is still a rookie. It is his fourth race in Formula 1, obviously with Monza in 2022, and it's too much. I think De Vries is not doing as bad as people are saying. It is the slowest car on the grid, and I don't think they can do much with that car apart from run in the back end of the grid and hope for a mad race like Australia where they can try and pick up a point, like Yuki Tsunoda did. It was a monster restart from Yuki on the third restart. I think he went up to fifth or something. It was one. He kind of just zipped through everyone, and it was a shame that he couldn't keep those points, because I really think that would have been the majority of the points that AlphaTauri would have got this year. So it was a real shame that he did get to keep those points. But he got a point because of Sainz's penalty. Shame that Crofty wasn't able to keep his 11 3 times in a row or whatever that was stat that he kept on bringing up throughout the race. But yeah, 10th for Yuki. It was a good race. He just has to do enough to keep his seat. Because since Australia, there has been a lot of kind of talk from Helmut Marko that he believes that Yuki is going to be in the car, in the Red Bull car in 2025. So Yuki just has to kind of keep on putting in those consistent performances, getting in the points when he can, and yeah, it's just a shame he couldn't keep the points for 5th place. And finally, going on to Williams, this car really does have some strong pace. Obviously, a great qualifying from Alex. I think he qualified 8th in the end, and then got up to 6th, I think, at the start of the race, obviously with Leclerc crashing out. But it was very unfortunate that he did have that crash, because he was running well. He was able to keep that position for the first couple laps. But I do believe that the team said that the accident wasn't entirely Alex's fault. It was a car issue. So yeah, it is just an unfortunate kind of what would have been. But I do think that car is going to be fighting for the points every race this season. It's kind of shown that that's where it is. And it is very exciting times for Williams, although that accident was very scary. And if it wasn't for Hulkenberg's kind of quick reactions, that could have been a massive, massive crash. And we're lucky that kind of Hulkenberg has that experience, that he's able to get out of the way of the Williams and kind of save everyone from that. Going on to Sargent, to finish off my side of the podcast, I genuinely do believe he would have been in the points if it wasn't for De Vries crashing to the back of him. Obviously with the 2 Alpines going out and Alonso spun around, hopefully he would have kind of gotten up there, but we wouldn't have known. So yeah, it's just a shame really. But if we're talking about a lot of hate on De Vries, I do think Sargent should be kind of getting a little bit... I never advocate for hate on drivers, but I do think Sargent should be under a little bit of criticism, mainly because of the fact that he is nowhere in comparison to Alex. In the race he is better, in the race he is definitely performing a lot better, but in qualifying, I think he qualified 18th, whereas Albon was kind of 8th, so it's kind of, he needs to pick up the pace, and especially in qualifying, because that Williams is strong in qualifying now. And it's kind of always been there in qualifying throughout the years, but this year it has the ability to be in Q3 every single time, every single race I think. And Sargent needs to be there getting qualifying, so at least if races like this happen, he can be in the race position to kind of try and pick up some points. So yeah, the Williams are in a good position, Sargent just needs to pick up the pace a little. So that's my part of the podcast done. Obviously it was weird not having Abby here. I was kind of just projecting rather than conversating. But I hope it was somewhat informative, and I know that Abby would be doing a lot better job than me, because she can just talk about regulations for ages. So yeah, let's go on to Abby for the outro of the podcast.
As a little ending thing, it's quite unique actually. When I was reading this, I thought, oh, this is actually quite funny. I don't think many people will know this, right? But basically, there was an issue raised on the FIA's official documents, right? A large group of spectators managed to break the security lines and access the track whilst the race was still ongoing. The security measures and the protocols, which were expected to be in place for the event, were not enforced, resulting in an unsafe environment for the spectators, drivers and race officials. Furthermore, spectators were also able to reach car number 27, which was parked at the exit of turn 2, which still had its light flashing red, which meant the car was unsafe and there was possible electric discharge. All of this presented significant danger to the spectators, race officials and drivers, right? So it's basically, they failed to put measures in place to stop people getting on the track, to basically safety measures, right? So this protest, I guess, not really, it's not really a protest, but the issue was against the promoters of the event, and the FIA brought it up and said, look, this is the issue, like we've had a massive issue here, and the promoters were like, oh yeah, we'll take it into account. Basically, I'm just speaking in layman's terms, but they basically said they'll review this and this before the next Australian Grand Prix. But that's so dangerous. I didn't even know about that, but the fact that they can access that car and they can access, I know they can access the track, we know that. At the end of the race, a lot of people go onto the track to watch the podium, right? The podium celebrations, but this was while the race is still going on. So, an interesting issue nonetheless. So that's it from me. I hope you enjoyed the insightful podcast. Obviously, like I said, me and Sam will be back together soon, filming together rather than just hearing one person talk the entire time. And we'll be more frequent with our videos as well, because obviously we've had a bit of a break, we've had exams and stuff, but we're gonna get back on it, and the content is gonna keep coming. So thanks so much for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe. I hate saying that, but do it. And yeah, we'll see you in the next video.